What if I told you that somewhere in America right now, a child is being born, who might one day become a killer, not because of what he does, but because of who he is, or maybe because of what the world will do to him? Tonight, we explore one of the most uncomfortable questions in psychology: are criminals born evil, or are they made? The boy named Ethan, in 2004, in a quiet neighborhood outside Chicago, a baby boy was born. His name was Ethan Cole, blonde hair, blue eyes, perfect hospital photos, nothing unusual. But by age 4, his preschool teacher noticed something strange. While other kids cried when someone got hurt, Ethan didn't react. When a classmate fell off the swings and started bleeding, Ethan just stared. No fear, no concern, no emotion. Psychologists call this low affective empathy. Some researchers believe that certain children show early signs of what's known as callous unemotional traits. And studies suggest these traits can be partly genetic. So the question begins, was something different in Ethan's brain from the start? In the 1990s, neuroscientists began scanning the brains of violent offenders. One study at the University of Wisconsin-Madison found that some individuals with severe antisocial behavior had reduced activity in the prefrontal cortex. That's the part of the brain responsible for impulse control, moral reasoning, decision-making. Later, neuroscientist Adrian Raines studied convicted murderers and discovered structural differences in their brains. Lower amygdala response, weaker emotional regulation. He proposed something radical: some people may be biologically predisposed to violence, not destiny, but vulnerability. And then there's genetics. The so-called warrior gene, MAOAL, has been linked in some studies to aggressive behavior, especially when combined with childhood abuse. So maybe evil has a biological blueprint, but biology alone doesn't pull the trigger. Ethan's home life wasn't perfect. His father, a former Marine, struggled with PTSD. His mother worked double shifts as a nurse. Arguments were common. Plates shattered, doors slammed. At age 7, Ethan witnessed his father shove his mother into a wall. No police report, no therapy, just silence. Child psychologists have long warned about adverse childhood experiences, ACEs. Studies conducted by the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention show that children exposed to violence are significantly more likely to develop behavioral disorders. Trauma reshapes the brain. The amygdala becomes hyperactive. The stress system never turns off, and over time, fear can turn into anger, anger can turn into numbness, and numbness can turn into cruelty. So was Ethan born different, or was he being programmed? By age 12, Ethan was suspended from school. Reason: he had been caught torturing a stray cat behind the gym. No tears, no apology, just a blank stare. Psychologists often reference the McDonald triad: animal cruelty, fire setting, and persistent bedwetting as early warning signs of potential violent behavior. Though controversial, the pattern appears in many violent offender histories. America has seen cases that shocked the nation, from at 15, Ethan was caught shoplifting electronics, not because he needed them, because he wanted to see if he could get away with it. The juvenile counselor recommended evaluation. An fMRI scan was conducted as part of a research program on adolescent impulse control. The results were interesting: reduced activity in the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, lower connectivity between emotional and decision-making centers in adult criminal populations. This pattern is often associated with antisocial personality disorder. But here's the catch: brain scans don't predict destiny, they show tendencies, and tendencies require environment to grow. Like seeds, some seeds grow into flowers, others into poison ivy. Senior year, prom season, Ethan asked a girl named Hannah to the dance. She laughed, not cruelly, just awkwardly, but to Ethan, it felt like humiliation. That night, something shifted. For the first time in years, he felt anger, real anger. But instead of yelling, he researched, he studied psychology forums, he read about power, control, dominance. He became obsessed with one idea: if emotions make people weak, then I will eliminate mine. What he didn't realize was that he already had. Ethan enrolled at Ohio State University. New city, new identity. He majored in neuroscience. Irony, maybe. Or maybe he wanted to understand what was wrong with him. Roommates described him as charming, Intelligent. Intense. He learned to mimic emotions. When someone was sad, he tilted his head. When someone laughed, he smiled, but inside, nothing. Psychologists call this cognitive empathy without emotional empathy. He understood feelings, he just didn't share them. At 20 years old, everything changed. A late-night argument with his roommate, Daniel. It started small, noise complaints, money issues. But Daniel said something that triggered Ethan. "You're not normal, man. There's something wrong with you." That sentence echoed, "Something wrong with you." Hours later, Daniel was found in the apartment kitchen, stabbed twice. No sign of forced entry, no defensive wounds. Police described the scene as disturbingly calm. Ethan called 911 himself. His voice steady, "I think my roommate is dead." Not panic, not shock, just observation. The courtroom in Columbus was packed. Media headlines exploded. Born psychopath? Cold-blooded college killer? The prosecution argued premeditation, emotional detachment, lack of remorse. The defense argued neurological impairment, childhood emotional neglect, brain abnormalities. Expert witnesses debated genetics versus environment. One psychiatrist testified, approximately 40 to 60% of psychopathic traits are heritable. Another countered, trauma and emotional deprivation significantly increase antisocial behavior. The jury listened, America watched, and the question grew louder: is evil something you inherit, or something society creates? The courtroom in Columbus was silent. Ethan sat motionless, no shaking hands, no visible fear, no regret. The prosecution painted him as calculated, cold, dangerous. They reminded the jury of the animal cruelty, the manipulation, the emotionless 911 call. The defense, however, brought brain scans onto a projector, images of Ethan's neural activity. Reduced function in the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, the neurologist explained. This region is critical for moral judgment and impulse control. They cited research from Harvard University suggesting that structural brain differences can increase violent tendencies when combined with childhood neglect. Then they introduced the genetic angle. A behavioral geneticist testified about the MAOAL variant, sometimes nicknamed the warrior gene. Studies showed that individuals carrying this variant were more likely to engage in antisocial behavior, but only when exposed to childhood abuse, only when triggered. So the defense asked the jury, if biology loads the gun and environment pulls the trigger, who is truly responsible? The prosecution countered, millions of people experience childhood trauma and never commit murder. The courtroom tension felt physical. After 14 hours of deliberation, the jury returned guilty of second-degree murder, not premeditated, but intentional. Ethan showed no reaction, and that lack of reaction disturbed everyone. Ethan was transferred to a maximum security facility in Ohio. Within months, prison psychologists evaluated him. Diagnosis: high psychopathic traits, not insanity, not schizophrenia, not delusion, just emotional emptiness. Researchers often use the Psychopathy Checklist Revised, PCLR, developed by Canadian psychologist Robert D. Hare. Ethan scored 31 out of 40. In the United States, a score above 30 typically qualifies as clinical psychopathy. Charm, lack of remorse, manipulation. Shallow effect. The psychologist wrote in his report, subject understands morality intellectually but does not experience it emotionally. Think about that. He knows killing is wrong, he just doesn't feel why. Studies conducted at University of California, Los Angeles found that violent offenders often show reduced gray matter in regions responsible for empathy. Brain imaging research has repeatedly shown abnormalities in the amygdala, emotion processing, the prefrontal cortex, impulse control, the anterior cingulate cortex, moral reasoning. Some scientists argue, if your brain lacks the wiring for empathy, you cannot simply choose to feel it. In fact, neuroscientist Adrian Raine once proposed that certain individuals may be biologically predisposed to violent behavior, not destined, but at higher risk. Imagine being born with a brain that experiences less fear, less guilt, less connection. Would you navigate the world differently? Most likely. But then comes the other side, the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study, one of the largest public health studies in U.S. history, conducted by the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, showed a powerful link between childhood trauma and adult criminal behavior. Children exposed to domestic violence, emotional neglect, physical abuse, substance abuse in the home were significantly more likely to develop aggression and antisocial traits. Trauma changes the stress response system. I keeps the brain in survival mode, and survival mode does not prioritize empathy, it prioritizes control. In Ethan's case, rigid father, emotional suppression, zero vulnerability allowed. He wasn't beaten daily, but he was emotionally starved. And emotional starvation can be just as damaging. In one famous research design, identical twins separated at birth were studied across decades. Identical DNA, different environments. In many cases, both twins displayed similar antisocial traits, but in others, one became violent. The other lived peacefully. This suggests something critical. Genetics create vulnerability. Environment determines outcome. Think of it like this: if genetics is the loaded gun, environment decides whether the safety stays on. History has forced this debate into the spotlight again and again. When experts analyzed the childhood of Ted Bundy, they noted emotional detachment and possible early trauma. Jeffrey Dahmer displayed early signs of isolation and fascination with dead animals. Eric Harris showed psychopathic traits combined with rage and resentment. Were they born different, or did neglect, rejection, and humiliation shape them? There is no simple answer, but one pattern keeps emerging. 2 years into his sentence, Ethan agreed to a recorded interview with a forensic psychologist. She asked, "Do you regret what you did?" He paused. "I regret the consequences." Not the act, the consequences. Did you feel anger? Yes. Did you feel guilt? No. Do you think you're evil? Another pause. "I think I'm different." That statement became the headline. "I think I'm different." Not broken, not monster, just different. Here's the part that makes this debate uncomfortable. If someone is born with diminished empathy, if their brain processes emotions differently, if their environment reinforces emotional suppression, how much free will do they truly have? American courts operate on the assumption of choice. You choose to commit a crime, you face consequences. But neuroscience is complicating that narrative. Some legal scholars argue that as brain science advances, the concept of moral. Here's the part that makes this debate uncomfortable. If someone is born with diminished empathy, if their brain processes emotions differently, if their environment reinforces emotional suppression, how much free will do they truly have? American courts operate on the assumption of choice. You choose to commit a crime, you face consequences. But neuroscience is complicating that narrative. Some legal scholars argue that as brain science advances, the concept of moral. Here's something rarely discussed. Approximately 1% of the general population meets criteria for psychopathy, yet only a fraction of them become violent criminals. That means, many individuals with psychopathic traits live normal lives. Some become CEOs, some become surgeons, some become politicians. The traits, fearlessness, charm, emotional detachment, can be adaptive in certain environments, so maybe the real issue isn't being born different, maybe it's where that difference is. Place. In chaos, it becomes destruction. In structure, it becomes power. And now, we reach the final question. If Ethan had grown up in a home with emotional warmth, if he had therapy at age 6, if someone had recognized the signs early, would Daniel still be alive, or was the outcome inevitable? For centuries, philosophers have argued about the nature of evil. Are humans born morally blank, shaped by experience? Or are some born with darkness embedded into their biology? In American history, this debate has influenced everything, from criminal sentencing to public policy. If evil is chosen, punishment makes sense. If evil is wired, treatment makes sense. But what if it's both? Modern neuroscience has complicated the idea of free will. Experiments have shown that brain activity related to decision-making can be detected milliseconds before a person consciously becomes aware of their choice. That means your brain may decide before you do. Now apply that to violence. If someone's neural wiring reduces empathy, if impulse control centers are underactive, If childhood trauma heightened threat perception, then when the moment of conflict arrives, are they choosing freely, or are they reacting predictably? This is where the debate becomes uncomfortable, because if behavior is predictable, is it still evil? For years into his sentence, Ethan enrolled in a prison neuroscience program. Ironically, he began studying the very mechanisms that defined him. One psychologist attempted cognitive behavioral therapy. The goal wasn't to create empathy. That might be impossible. The goal was to create awareness, to teach him to pause, to analyze consequences before acting. Interestingly, studies show that while core psychopathic traits rarely disappear, behavioral outcomes can improve with structured intervention. In other words, you may not change the wiring, but you can manage the system, and that realization shifts the debate again. If management is possible, then maybe prevention is possible. Most violent offenders share three factors: genetic vulnerability, early emotional neglect or trauma, lack of early psychological intervention. Rarely is it just one, it's convergence, a storm forming slowly over years. The truth is far less dramatic than the movies. There are no children born with evil stamped on their forehead. There are children born with risk factors, and risk factors require environment to activate. Just like a genetic predisposition to heart disease requires lifestyle triggers. The difference: when it's the heart, we talk about prevention; when it's violence, we talk about monsters. Now here's something that might surprise you. Remember that statistic from earlier? About 1% of the population scoring high on psychopathy scales. Many of them never commit crimes. Some become surgeons, able to operate without emotional interference. Some become corporate leaders, fearless in decision-making. Some become military strategists, calm under pressure. The same traits that create destruction in chaos create success in structure. So maybe the real question isn't, are people born evil? Maybe the question is, what environment does their brain land in? Ethan's traits in a different context might have made him brilliant, controlled, disciplined. Instead, his emotional development stalled, and when pressure hit, there was no internal brake system. But here's the part that theory cannot erase: Daniel is still gone. His parents still visit a grave. For them, this is not philosophy, it's loss, and that forces us to remember something crucial: understanding causes does not remove responsibility. Explanation is not excuse. Society can acknowledge biology and trauma, and still protect itself. That's the balance American justice attempts to strike. 5 years into his sentence, Ethan wrote something unexpected in a therapy journal. I don't feel guilt the way others describe it, but I understand that what I did caused pain. If I had known how to control my anger earlier, maybe this wouldn't have happened. Notice the language: not sorrow, not remorse, but cognitive recognition, and sometimes, that's the closest psychopathy gets to growth. So let's bring it back to you. If a child is born with reduced emotional sensitivity, genetic predisposition toward aggression, lower fear response, and that child grows up in emotional neglect, suppressed vulnerability, no early therapy, and later commits violence, where do you place the blame? On the genes, on the parents, on society, on the individual, or on all of it? Because science increasingly suggests evil is rarely singular, it's layered. Biology lays the foundation. Environment builds the structure. Choice decorates the interior. Chapter 28. The uncomfortable truth. The most unsettling part of this debate is not about Ethan, it's about us. If violent behavior is predictable through early signs, should we screen children? If brain scans show high-risk patterns, should intervention be mandatory? If genetics suggest vulnerability, do we label someone before they act? That path becomes dangerous. History has shown us what happens when societies label people based on biology. So we walk a tightrope between prevention and prejudice, between compassion and accountability. After decades of research, the consensus among many psychologists is this: there is no single evil gene. There is no single traumatic event that guarantees violence. Instead, violence is the result of interacting systems: brain structure, hormonal regulation, childhood attachment, social modeling, stress exposure. And complexity doesn't make headlines. Born monster is simpler, but rarely accurate. The closing question. So now, let's imagine something. Somewhere in America tonight, a baby is being born. That child may have lower emotional reactivity, higher impulsivity, a fearless temperament, in one home, that child will receive therapy, structure, emotional coaching, in another, that child will experience neglect, chaos, humiliation. 20 years later, their lives may look completely diff. Same biology, different outcome, and that may be the clearest answer we have. Ethan wasn't born holding a knife, he was born holding potential. Potential shaped by wiring, potential shaped by experience, potential shaped by choices. So, was he born evil? Or made evil? Maybe the real answer is this: no one is born a monster, but under the wrong combination of biology and environment, a monster can emerge, and understanding that truth might be the. Now I want to hear from you. Do you believe criminals are born different, or does society create them? Comment below, because this debate isn't just scientific, it's moral, and it affects how we judge, punish, and prevent.